Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving right into a seriously intense era in modern Britain, looking at the years between 1962 and 1974. We're going to explore this massive historical tug-of-war. On one side, you've got strict government legislation, and on the exact opposite side, you've got this passionate, highly organized public pushback. It's a fascinating, transformative period that literally reshaped British society. So let's just jump straight into the facts and see how this all played out. To give you a quick roadmap of this high-stakes era, here's the timeline. 1962, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act. 1963, the Bristol bus boycott. 1968 gives us the Rivers of Blood speech and a new act. 1971, the Immigration Act. And 1974, the Imperial Typewriter Strike. Notice a pattern? Pretty much every time the state imposed restriction, the people fired back. It wasn't a one-way street. It was an absolute slugfest.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to frame this history as a live debate. Think of it like a heavyweight match. In one corner, making the point, we have the state, constantly tightening control. And in the other corner, delivering the counterpoint, we have the public, migrants and their allies, organizing at the grassroots level to demand fair treatment. Now, before the 1960s, Britain practically had a wide open door policy for Commonwealth citizens. These were folks from former British territories, specifically invited over to help rebuild the nation after World War II. But to understand our very first point from the state, we have to look at the massive shift toward a closed-door policy, essentially a much tighter, restrictive legal approach to who could come in.
Let's use a metaphor here. Imagine Britain as a house with a huge, welcoming front door. The government didn't just slam it shut all at once. It was a process. Step 1 was the 1962 Act, giving the door a heavy push. Step 2, the 1968 Act, pushed it until it was just a crack. And finally, Step 3, the 1971 Immigration Act, turned the deadbolt and completely locked it. Let's break down that first push.
All right, point 1 for the state. The 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act. This officially kicked off the restrictions on the right of Commonwealth citizens to enter and settle in the UK. Suddenly, there were strict new employment and accommodation hurdles to jump through. Literally overnight, migration went from an open, friendly invitation to a highly controlled, monitored system. But as you can guess, the public didn't just take this lying down, which brings us to the ultimate tool of grassroots resistance, the boycott. If you're not familiar, a boycott is basically refusing to use or buy something as a form of protest. You know, hitting them where it hurts, their wallets. When the rules felt rigged, everyday people used their economic power to force a change.
And that leads us to our first massive counterpoint from the public. In 1963, we get the legendary Bristol bus boycott. A local bus company flat out refused to hire Black or Asian drivers. So what did the community do? Migrants and allies boycotted the buses entirely until the company caved and overturned the racist policy. A huge win. And the momentum kept going. By 1964, folks had formed the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, or CARD, to fight for equal rights on a national scale.
So you might be wondering, why was the government trying to close the door in the first place? Well, looking at the historical sources from the 50s and 60s, tensions were running incredibly high. You had politicians, newspapers, and certain groups actively blaming migrants for everyday domestic problems, things like housing shortages and unemployment. Whether the data backed it up or not, this narrative spread like wildfire and created massive political pressure. Naturally, as this debate boiled over, the language politicians used got really intense, which brings up a key concept for this explainer: rhetoric. Rhetoric is basically the art of persuasive speech. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it to stir up emotions and drive a very specific political agenda.
Back to the States Corner. In 1968, conservative politician Enoch Powell delivered his infamous Rivers of Blood speech. As impartial historical reporters, we look at this as a massive, deeply controversial turning point. It was a masterclass in anti-immigrant rhetoric that cranked up social tensions to a 10 and fundamentally shifted the national conversation. And almost right on cue, government action mirrored that very rhetoric. The 1968 Commonwealth Immigrants Act pushed our metaphorical door almost entirely shut. It created a permanent system of control that, for all intents and purposes, excluded the vast majority of Commonwealth citizens from settling in the UK. The climax of all this state control hits in 1971. The 1971 Immigration Act clamped down on entry and settlement even more, locking in a permanent, highly restrictive legal framework. Back to our metaphor, if 1962 and 1968 pushed the heavy door shut, the 1971 Act was the final heavy lock clicking into place.
The post-war era of the open welcome mat was officially history.
But hey, what about the folks already inside the house? The debate wasn't just about borders, it was about basic human treatment. And the people already living and working in Britain refused to be sidelined. This brings us to our final counterpoint: direct, on-the-ground workplace resistance. When workers faced discrimination based on who they were, they simply downed tools and demanded better.
The sheer grit of this era is perfectly captured by events like the 1974 Imperial Typewriter strike over in Leicester. Migrant workers incredibly bravely organized against unfair treatment and massive racial pay gaps right on the factory floor. They proved, without a doubt, that the fight wasn't just happening in the halls of Parliament, it was happening at the literal typewriters.
Honestly, you can't overstate the impact of these movements. These strikes, the boycotts, the grassroots hustle, they didn't just fix local issues. They proved that migrant workers were now a deeply rooted, highly organized, and totally visible force within the UK labor movement. They were staking their claim and demanding their rightful place in modern Britain.
So if you take one thing away from this explainer, let it be this incredible dual reality. As the government squeezed tighter and tighter with restrictive border laws, anti-racist organizers on the ground push back with equal and opposite force, becoming more visible, determined, and incredibly powerful.
We've covered a ton of ground today, seeing how speeches, laws, and strikes totally reshaped a nation. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. When the state tries its hardest to close the door, can organized protest ultimately rewrite the law, shift public attitudes, and build lasting community confidence? Think about that balance of power, because that same debate is absolutely still shaping our world right now. Keep asking those big questions.